Doug has thrown himself into the industry and is well regarded Australia-wide, to ministers, to departments and whatever. And he's made a statement that's fully aware of the ageing demographics. So there's no one better to address us on that, so would you please welcome Doug.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, President Bryan, for the opportunity to speak. President Bryan, fellow Rotarians and guests, today what I'll be speaking about is talking about an ageing South Australia, the demographics, and what that means for our state and our nation. Yep, it's working. The issue is around saying, is it a curse or a blessing? And often, unfortunately, our society tends to talk about ageing as very much a curse. And what I want to do today is actually put down some facts, and whilst I have a personal view about it, hopefully allow you also to establish your view. Because what I want to do, the challenge for me, is to say often what we see in our society is older people, as an older lady looking out the window, or an ageing baby boomer trying to deny himself that he's getting older. And really what you've got is these people are sitting around waiting in God's waiting room, ready to shuffle off this mortal coil because they've determined that they no longer have an ability to contribute. When in fact what we have in Australia amongst older people is actually people who've got all sorts of abilities to contribute and contributions, and we need to actually unlock that. So the agenda for today is I'll talk a bit about the demographics. One of the great things about demographics is it's about numbers, it's about predictability, it's about longer term. I'll talk about who the emerging senior is, and as I understand it, there's even a couple of emerging seniors we've got in the audience here. And also talking about the opportunity it presents for our state. First of all, let's look at the demographics. In 1950, and hopefully people can see this all right, so it starts at the top as 0 to 4. There, this is the baby boomers, all those soldiers who returned from the war and populated Australia. And if you look at down the bottom there, we didn't really have many old people post World War II. And I'll show you why that was the case. But it's quite small numbers there. In fact, not only in that graph is it small, they don't even number or put the percentages there because it's just so minor. 1975, 1975, one of the most important years in Australia's history. I joined the army in 1975. You start to see that the numbers of younger people are starting to drop, and you're starting to see some pick up. But this is 1975, it's a long time ago in the minds of most people. 13 million people then. In the year 2000, again we're seeing that changing in the demographic as the baby boomers are starting to move through the years. To effectively today, 2011, that's the sort of figures that we're seeing. And in those older groups now, we're actually seeing that they're actually showing what the numbers are in the percentages, so they're becoming somewhat more significant. If we then project forward, 2030, you see again that not only the numbers growing, but actually now even in people over 85, they've got numbers and percentages. But let's go forward to the time when here at the Rotary Club of Adelaide, and I'd like to invite you all to my 100th birthday in the year 2057. And hopefully you'll all be here, certainly hopefully I'll be here, and what the projection is for our population. Now, okay, we're talking here about somewhere in the order of 45 years forward in the projection, and obviously the statistical significance becomes what's somewhat more sort of broader. But I do say you must remember that the people who are 45 and above have already been born. Okay? You don't get parachuted in this world and born at the age of 45. We all get born at year 0. So people born at year 0 we know is that once we extrapolate that out, they're the people who are going to be 45 years at this time. So when you start to look at those older age groups, there's a lot of predictability around what those older age groups will be. If you then look at that group that we're talking about, our seniors, is around that group there. So you're now starting to see quite large numbers. And what I wanted to do was, we've gone a bit of a history lesson there, or through some time. We've gone through 100 years. But if I take it back and say, what were they back in 1950 when we had less than 10 million people? That's what we had. A very small percentage of people that were over 65. And if we then go forward to where we are effectively predicting in 2057, you can see there's a very different change in those age profiles. The ABS, they talk about going from pyramid to coffin. A bit sad really, but back in 1925, that's the age demographic. Not too many people got to the peak of the pyramid. We then broadened out, and in 2045, 2050, we'll have that broadening around that higher end. And unfortunately, the concept of looking at from pyramid to coffin actually indicates something of a psychological sense of our continuing sense of, as we get older, and a continuing sense of seniors is something of a bit gloomy. It's something that's seen as bad. Well, let's actually look at who the emerging senior is that we have. This slide here shows basically the age projections back before World War II, in this case 1929. In 1929, the average person lived to be to the age of 63. Okay, that's not saying nobody lived beyond 63, but on average, they shuffled off the mortal coil before they got to retirement age of 65. These are the people that were, back before the war. People here would remember these sorts of people, because I hazard to guess that nobody here would be of a generation that experienced life prior to the war, other than as maybe a young child. The issue, things I'd say is no teenage years. You went straight from being a kid to an adult, usually about the age of 13 or 14. You got old early, so usually in your mid-50s, you're old and you worked. And then what happened is you had the great honour to die before you even got to pension age. Effectively, before World War II, we didn't really have a seniors population. And if we did, the seniors population started at about 45. The 1960s, and many of us would consider ourselves children of the 1960s. I certainly do. In the 1960s, the age then was, I think it's 73 on average. This is the, or 72. This is the population that was my grandfather, who passed away in 1968, who worked all his life. In fact, was involved with Foss and Harrison in the shoe industry, and Foss was a member of this club, and I remember speaking to Foss, who actually knew my grandfather. And the aim then was that, first of all, we discovered teenage years, and they were fantastic. It's so unfortunate we waste those teenage years on the young. But we discovered teenage years, so we did get the opportunity to enjoy those. That was a discovery of the 60s. People still got old before they retired, but they did get into those retirement years, usually very modest retirement years, usually struggled to pay off their house, their aim being that by the time that they retired, they paid off their house, and they didn't have a mortgage. They then went on to a very modest welfare payment called pension, had those few years for usually the grandpa who had health issues, who then passed away early, and grandma invariably was a Masonic widow, moved into a one-bedroom Masonic unit or like, and lived a very modest life until sadly, invariably she had her stroke, and then she too joined her husband. now what we're talking about, and whilst on this slide we talk of in 2009, we're now living on average to, I think it's there, 83. We've actually discovered a whole new generation. People are now retiring, not when they're old, they're still retiring when they've got capacity. I'm not saying this is all people, but what I'm saying is that we now have got a new generation, which is effectively, and I know there's many of them in this room here, who are the baby boomers who are retiring, and they've actually, for the first time in history, we have two generations in retirement. Traditionally, there was that last struggling generation that went to retirement, lived out those last few years and moved on. What we now have is people moving into retirement that have got parents who have retired before them, who are still independent, still active, still have expectation, and as the 60-year-old boomer who's retired talks about the fact that wants to look after, wants to ensure that parents are still looked after, and the parents have got their own expectations. We've changed so much about life. The only thing that I'd say, and this affects some in this room, is the fact that teenage years have now extended from being 13 to 19 to I think something like 13 to 30. But they never leave now. So that's one of the downsides. But for we children of the 60s, the fantastic thing is that we're going to get to live teenage years again, although maybe we're not quite as svelte as we were back in the 60s. But this is a demographic fact. And if you go back to that generation before the war, there's a whole new generation in there that's now being placed into our community. And one of the questions I pose, is that a bad thing? Is that something we should lament and say wasn't so much better when we actually all died younger and we made sure that we worked the hell out of ourselves? The reality is that I think it's fair to say that every generation wants to make life better for the next. So thanks to all those earlier generations. Let's look at the opportunity in ageing South Australia. We often hear about South Australia as ageing, the fact that we are the oldest on average population on the mainland. If we look at this from the ABS again, this talks about what is the mean age for the various states. Mean age is the number at which there's equal between the ones younger and the ones older. The black dots are what was the situation in 1990, and the clear dots are what the situation is in 2010. Our youngest state, or territory, Northern Territory, down the bottom there, that sort of continues as something of an outlier there, with the Northern Territory. And our oldest jurisdiction, Tasmania. And you'll see in Tasmania there's certainly been a significant increase in the average age there, or the median age for Tasmania. If you look at South Australia, we've moved from 1990 a 33 average. We're now sitting at somewhere in the order of about 39 over those 20 years. But if you look at Victoria as something of another manufacturing state, they too have aged. And if you look at all of our states and jurisdictions, if you look at what the situation is back in 1990, there was something of a band there, and whilst it was broader, and we've got NT and ACT that are younger. If you come forward those 20 years, again, we're all sitting within a reasonable band. It's not as though we're talking about an average age, which is 10 years difference between the mainland states and in Australia. But we've all aged. All the states and territories have aged. If we do it on another graphic dimension, you look here and say, again, NT and the ACT stand out at the lower end there. The other mainland states, or the mainland states in the middle, and again, Tasmania and South Australia. But again, it's not something which is a huge separation. Let's have a look around the world. And and I had an article in the paper the other day and I quoted about something, but if you look around the world, Australia's average age, 37.5. Let's look at some of our major trading partners, or probably those we're competing with. And if we just bounce around for a moment, Japan, 44.6. And if you look at the miracle states, the BRIC states, Brazil, Russia, India and China, certainly Brazil and India are much younger. But if you look at countries like Russia and China, again, they're within something of a band for us. And as I was in the paper, and if you really want to aspire to having the concept of a young population, get yourself to Uganda. That means that half of the people don't live beyond the age of 15. You know, and I mean that in a real sense, is the fact that if you look at the world, it is a world that's ageing. Why is our population ageing? Why is our population ageing? It's ageing because we're keeping the aged. It's the fact that with all the advances that we've got, people are living longer. It is not because we're not keeping the youth, okay? It's not because there's not enough young people coming through. The fact is that if we want to get our average age down, then all those awful movies that you used to see back in the 70s, Soylent Green and whatever, what we've got to do is to make sure that we get rid of the high numbers at that top end, and that'll get our average growth down. And all those willing to volunteer to be in that, please raise your right hand and I'll take your names and we'll forward those through to the appropriate authorities. The SA Senior, and the fact is that the SA Senior is really no different than the seniors that we have anywhere in Australia. They are not a welfare class. Back in the 1960s, older people were a welfare class defined by age alone. The wealth of this nation was not based around our older people. The older people had consumed their wealth as they got into their older years, and what they then did was they then went on to a pension, and wealth was based in those middle years. Oops. Oh, sorry. It's all right. No, got it. If you look at the government has just done a report realising the economic potential of senior Australians, and just to quickly read through, as it's looking at what is the economic potential of seniors. So the government just recently released a report, and it's saying that in 2010, 4.2 million over 60. That's going to rise to 5.5 million by 2020 and 10 million by 2050. Now that's demographics. I mean, that's predictable. The emerging cohort of senior Australians are the wealthiest generation that Australia's ever seen. And that's a fact. A lot of that's based around, as it says later, about residential properties. It's also based around initiatives the government took about super. But the Australians aged 45 to 64 comprise 1/4 of our population, but they hold half of the wealth. And I happen to be one of those, and I know there's many in this room, and we aren't going to surrender that wealth. We expect to continue to grow that wealth. We're the baby boomers, and we're the ones that often have that older mother or father ahead of us who often denies themselves to save for us. And that's something which our nation needs to really review and actually say we need to unlock that wealth of those seniors. Other issues, senior South Australians, senior Australia, they're living longer and healthier. They will continue to contribute. They are not net, they're not net detractors from our economy. They're active consumers. And in today's world of today's capital constrained world, the reality, I speak to some of the members before, capital is held in the hands of older people. That's why I took the photo of it's actually not the South Australian Stock Exchange, but it's overseas. But the reality is, you go to any shareholder meeting, the one thing that a CEO or chairman of any listed company ensures is that morning tea, after tea or lunch are really, really good. Because the shareholders, the come along invariably with a predominance of grey or potentially no hair at all. They're the ones. It ain't crazy young guys or gals who get along to those shareholder meetings. And they are the growth demographic. No, time's getting short. If I quickly talk about the industry here, there's lots of enterprises, and I'm very mindful that a number of members here are active in those organisations, have been active in those organisations, and of course I should also recognise the fact that many have been active in the organisation I've gone to be the CEO of, either as staff, chairman, directors, certainly Colin Brights, and also, if I just recognise Tony Robins as a part of his recognition, was the role he played earlier in the work of the homes. It's a big industry. It's a big industry. You'll find that if you look at South Australia's top 100 companies, if you actually looked at it for revenues and whatever, you'll find that many aged care and retirement village operators will sit in those top 100 companies. Retirement living is basically the number of retirement units that we have around Australia by state. South Australia sits in there. We've got about 14,000 or so retirement units with about closing on 400 retirement villages, and that's growing every day. I would say the industry value, $30 billion, the largest owners of property in Australia, outside of government and outside of the hotel and motel industry, is the retirement living and aged care space. And if you doubt me, you drive home after the meeting and you just notice how many nursing homes, retirement villages and whatever on your way home with great pieces of property. Retirement units, this figure here shows the growth, and even if it's at current rates, which is about 4%, what the lift will be, and the expectation is that will actually be higher. As I come to a close, talking about the opportunity, and please don't interpret this, I'm not trying to criticise anyone, but if you look at the state strategic plan, Masonic Homes is a great supporter of the state strategic plan and also of the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. Often, and I had lunch with John Henner yesterday, we look at South Australia as the defence state, which is fantastic. I have a long history with defence and still a commitment to the security of Australia. But when you look at it from an economic sense, all you need is changes in political. People start to question things in strategic sense, and your defence industry one day as the diamond in the rough can suddenly disappear and they move somewhere else. If you look at seniors, here's the projection of government spending. These are Treasury projections. On the left, as you look at it, those areas are probably related to health. This is government spending, and so it's just as a proxy for general spending. What they expect to see in health, age-related pensions and aged care. If you look at defence, and you start to look where defence projections are as actually as a part of GDP, it'll be a falling percentage, which in many respects is probably good. But if you're an investor, you start to say, do you want to invest in those areas or the areas of growth? If you look at David Langdon did some projections, what's the community think? Where investments will be, and again, retirement and aged care is where they look at investment going. It's supporting our seniors, and without trying to knock defence sits well down there on where the projections are. Okay, now I accept that people will say, yes, but what about the long term? Isn't there long-term issues? Well, again, going back to David Langdon, that's what they've projected over a number of years, and that brownie sort of line, third from the top, if you go to the very right of the slide, is that area of retirement and aged care. And if you go back over that time, you'll see that for all of those years, that orange line has remained well up. It's a long-term expectation. Seniors are a growth demographic, and at the end of the day, they will drive so much about our economic future. Finally, in closing, BI Shrapnel, only a few days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, they released their long-term forecasts. And the issue that they had was the fact that they've identified that a lot of the down-talking that Treasury have had about an ageing population has been overstated, and actually an ageing population necessarily isn't a bad thing. And finally, I should give the last, or the second, well, almost the last word. If we look at all of those older Australians, they're not all older Australians, one's Warren Buffett, but what they are is they're out there contributing. Most of those people on those slides actually are 80. Warren Buffett, he's 80, he had his 80th birthday the other day. They're involved and active in our community. The last word that I should leave is with our 27th Prime Minister that I now know. And that is that we need to look at our older Australians as an asset to be valued rather as a problem to be solved. And as I said, that's our 27th Prime Minister who said that, and I think that's a great. An ageing South Australia, we should be really pleased. It's a great blessing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Doug, for a tremendous presentation. Very detailed, very interesting and useful. And while I present you with a magic pen, would you please join me in thanking Doug?
To learn more about Rotary, check out our website at the web address below.